Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT Kanpur. In this week, I am talking to you about bilingualism and its relationship with other cognitive functions. We've talked about bilingualism and its relationship with language and thought. In this lecture, I will basically be talking to you about bilingualism and executive control. Are bilinguals actually good at executive control? Now, in the previous lectures, we have actually, reviewed some of the advantages associated with being a bilingual. However, one of the most studied hypotheses that affects that basically talks about the effects of bilingualism on other cognitive functions has been the fact that due to their practice with managing the two co-activated languages, bilinguals actually become better at tasks that require executive control. What is executive control? Now, before we sort of go into the discussion in this lecture in understanding executive control is basically a set of functions that is mainly handled by the frontal regions of our brain, the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, the caudate nuclei, and so on. So there are 3 or 4 regions that have been identified that take care of this, the functions clubbed under executive control. But what is this executive control? How do I explain this to you in layman terms? Now, if you see in several situations, there are instances where you have to go for something or restrict yourself from something. Say, for example, while you've just finished your dinner and you sort of are passing by, you're taking a walk. At night, an ice cream seller passes by. Now you know that you've had your dinner, you've had your whole quota of calories, but there is this very nice ice cream seller that is passing by, and you're sort of tempted to go for this ice cream. Now, in this case, some of us would be able to suppress our urge to have an ice cream, and some of us will not be able to do that. This whole capability of suppressing a particular kind of response and selecting another response is one of the examples of cognitive control. There are other ways also of looking at it. Say, for example, being alert to new information, being able to orient to new information, and staying focused at it. All of these cases where, say, for example, there are 2 possible responses and you have to give only one. See, bilinguals have to do this all the time. Whenever I am presenting to you, let's say, any picture of an object, and so say, for example, my favorite example, I show you a picture of an apple, you have 2 possible responses to give. You have the, idea of taking the word seb in Hindi or saying the word apple in English. There are always 2 possible responses to any concept that you are talking to with a bilingual. And what the bilingual actually has to do is he has to manage one of these 2, suppress the irrelevant response. Say, for example, if I'm talking to a purely Hindi speaking individual, I have to suppress the name apple and I have to activate the name, seb, and say it. Remember, we've been talking about the language control system in the previous week. And we have seen that this language control system is very necessary. It is very important in order for a bilingual to be able to speak or manage their 2 languages without interference from the other. And this is something that has been a very important area of research amongst a lot of researchers, most notable of them being Ellen Bialystok and her colleagues, who've actually worked in this area over a couple of decades, probably more than that, and have examined various aspects of this topic. Now, one of the most popular tasks that have been used for some of these experiments was the Simon task. Now, the Simon task is actually a perceptual motor task that seeks to assess a participant's ability to inhibit or ignore irrelevant spatial information, and it is basically a skill that requires a lot of executive control. The idea is participants are seated in front of a computer screen where the stimuli, for example, squares in different colors are present. Say, for example, you could be present with a red square or a blue square or a green square, and let's go with blue and red. So if you are presented with a red square, you have to press with your right hand, and if the red square is present on the right side of the screen, you have to present with your right hand. If a red square is present on the left side of the screen, you have to present with your left hand. Now, there is this stimulus response mapping that is established. So if you see this color of a square presented on that side of the screen, you have to press with your this hand. If it is this color of a square presented on that side of the screen, you have to press with your this hand. Now in some cases the situation will be congruent, so a blue square will actually be presented on the right side and you can press the key on with your right hand. But in some cases the blue square could be present on the left side of the screen, and then you have to present with your other hand. And this response mapping, its congruence and its incongruence is actually the challenge in this task. It is because of this variable response mapping that can actually happen, and that there can be a congruent response and there an incongruent response, a correct or an incorrect response possible, because these stimuli are bivalent. They basically can be responded to with their left hand or their right hand depending upon which side of the screen they are happening. So the instruction for the participants here is to press a key on the left side of the keyboard if the blue square is presented, and the right side if the red square is presented, so depending on the color of the square. So this is something that really tests the participants executive control, their correct selection of response and their correct inhibition of a particular response. Now obviously in this task overall, the congruent and incongruent trials are presented in a random unpredictable order. Typically what has been observed is that incongruent trials lead to longer response times and more errors, and this effect has been known as the Simon effect. This effect has been referred to in literature as the Simon effect. Now obviously initial studies have actually shown that bilinguals are somewhat better at general executive control, general intelligence and even metalinguistic tasks, as we have seen in so far, but the new set of studies that basically was undertaken initially by Ellen Bialystok actually wanted to test whether this advantage in general intelligence extends to non-linguistic domains as well, or non-linguistic aspects of executive control as well. Now more similar questions were raised about whether the advantage so far observed with balanced bilinguals would also of young balanced bilinguals would extend to bilinguals of different age groups. People were also interested in knowing whether bilinguals could also provide a defense against the normal cognitive decline that is observed in frontotemporal dementia, Alzheimer's and so on. Finally, some of the interesting questions, some of the questions that people were interested in also had to do with that what is the neural basis of this language control system, of this executive control system that inhibits irrelevant information. Some of the answers, by the way, if you see, we have talked about in the chapter on the neuroscience of bilingualism and the brain. Now, across a range of studies that actually employed this Simon task with bilinguals, a smaller Simon effect was observed in bilinguals as compared to monolinguals, and the same was actually seen as the main marker of the more efficient inhibitory control amongst bilinguals. Also, the researchers examined the bilinguals' performance over the whole task, and bilinguals were expected to be better in overall performance as well compared to the monolinguals. Now, to investigate these questions in more detail, the initial studies by Bialystok and her colleagues, matched monolingual children of different age groups with, say for example, young adults, middle-aged, and older adults with groups of bilinguals in the same age groups, and had both of them, all of these groups perform the Simon task. So, and in order to gain more detailed insight into the relationship between bilingualism and cognitive control, in addition to the congruent and incongruent manipulation, the researchers added 3 other types of manipulations as well. For example, when they wanted to investigate the effects of increasing working memory demands in the Simon task, they added a condition with 4 rather than 2 colors and instructed the participants to press the left hand key in reply of 2 of these colors. Say for example, you could have red, green, blue, orange squares, and red and green have to be responded with one hand and blue and orange have to be responded with the other hand. Okay, so typically now what is happening is, instead of remembering the mapping of one color with one response hand, they have to remember the mapping of 2 colors with one response hand, and this obviously increases the amount of information that they have to maintain in their working memory. Basically what they are doing is they are actually placing more working memory demands in this task of executive control that these individuals have to perform during the Simon task. So you can say at the same time both executive control abilities and working memory capabilities are being tested at the same time. Secondly, the researchers also included a control condition in which the color stimulus to be presented always appeared in the center of the screen. So basically, you don't have to basically remember which side of the screen the square is being presented, and it basically, depending on wherever the color is presenting, you have to press it accordingly. So this manipulation was actually meant to rule out the possibility that a bilingual advantage was merely due to the overall speed of the bilinguals, or it actually had to do something with the better managing of stimulus response mapping in bilinguals as compared to monolinguals. Finally, the authors also sought to observe the effects of practice. They wanted to check if increased practice was the reason for the small Simon effect observed in bilinguals as opposed to monolinguals. So the Simon task per se is a slightly complicated task, and you add some of these manipulations on top of it, and you make the task relatively more difficult, or basically design it to test very specific hypotheses about how bilinguals actually perform in this given task. Now, the combined studies which actually used the Simon task provided very clear and consistent answers to these questions. For example, to begin with, accepting the population of young adults, specifically university undergraduates, among all participant populations, generally they actually showed reliably small Simon effects and or performed better overall on the Simon task than monolinguals. So all groups of bilinguals are actually performing better than monolinguals on this Simon task, showing less disruption from misleading information and therefore better inhibitory control. Also, the authors regarded the absence of an effect of bilingualism among undergraduate university students as a ceiling effect, because they already have reached the peak of their performance, and therefore they are not being able to show the better performance between bilinguals and monolinguals in this particular age group. Secondly, bilinguals are actually less disrupted than monolinguals by an increase in working memory load. So not only they are being able to manage executive control relatively well, they are also being able to handle higher working memory demands at the same time. So it basically tells us that actually bilingualism is providing benefits not only in terms of inhibitory control, but also in terms of handling larger working memory demands at the same time. Thirdly, as per the expectations, aging was actually associated with less efficient executive control, as evidenced both by relatively large detrimental effects of increases in working memory demands and by increases in the Simon effect along with age. So in older age groups, you would see that performance of these individuals would be affected badly by increasing working memory demands, and typically they were poorer as compared to younger adults in managing the Simon effect. So the magnitude of the Simon effect was also found to be larger in these older adults. Fourthly, the negative effects of aging were found to be considerably smaller for bilinguals than monolinguals. Remember, we were talking about the question that researchers were interested in knowing whether bilingualism can act as a shield for the detrimental effects of aging, for detrimental effects of normal cognitive decline that comes with age. And here we see there is some evidence of the fact that bilingualism actually shields people from normal cognitive decline as would be expected along with growing age. Fifth, in the majority of cases, the possibility could be excluded that the beneficial effect of bilingualism simply concerned just a speed advantage, that they are typically faster on everything. It actually focused on a very specific aspect of managing executive control, better response inhibition and better response selection that is actually leading to this advantage. Finally, it was also shown that with extended practice, the negative effects of increased working memory load was equally large in both groups, and the Simon effect was reduced to zero with increased practice in both groups. So it basically tells us that practice can be one of the factors between bilinguals and monolinguals, but if you give equal practice to both, then obviously bilinguals are performing slightly better. Now, overall, these findings, if you look at them in totality, actually constitute compelling evidence that the same executive control capabilities involved in managing the two languages of a bilingual are also involved in other tasks that require general executive control, even though those tasks will be non-verbal. And The data from the working memory load experiments actually indicates that bilingualism also boosts working memory capacity for tasks that require executive control. All in all, if you look at these results collectively, bilingualism actually seems to yield benefits across a larger set of studies, and has an overall appeal to general executive processes. However, researchers have reasoned that if the beneficial effects of bilingualism are indeed the result of the use of a more general non-bilingualism specific control processes, as initially the inhibitory control model had talked about, if you remember that we were talking about, whether this is a domain general or a domain specific effect, expertise in other domains that exploit the same control processes should similarly affect performance in the Simon task. And this is what Bialystok and colleagues wanted to test in 2005. So what did they do? They divided a group of young adults, college undergraduates, into a subgroup of youngsters who spent much more time playing video games, as opposed to a group who spent very less time in playing video games. Again, when they compared these groups and their performance on the Simon task, the results were pretty clear. Performance on the Simon task was significantly better in the group who played video games more frequently than in the group who played video games slightly, very less. So it basically tells us that performing, any kind of practice with executive control abilities, even if it is just playing video games, actually improves executive control. In some sense, you can actually connect this to the fact that any task, bilingualism or bilingualism which is language specific, or non-verbal tasks which actually provide some practice with executive control, will have a similar beneficial effect on individuals' executive control capabilities. So while the results from the Simon task have actually supported the notion that bilinguals do have a certain advantage with respect to their abilities of executive control, in order to get a even better and even deeper understanding of the underlying issues, researchers have also started comparing the performance of monolinguals and bilinguals on other tasks that may allow the measurement of different aspects of cognitive control. For example, Martin Ree and Bialystok in 2008 administered the Simon task along with the Stroop-like task, which is the day-night task wherein the participants, monolinguals and bilingual children of around 4 to 5 years, were asked to say day to a picture of a moonlit sky, and night to a picture of a bright sunny day. So basically you have to see pictures of day and say night, you have to see pictures of night and say day. And again, see, this is a case where a certain degree of response inhibition is required, and the performance can be compared on two tasks which are measuring similar kinds of things. So it would provide a sort of a cross correlation of whether the same abilities are being tested or not. What did they find? The day-night task obviously affords the researchers to examine their participants' ability for response inhibition, as opposed to the Simon task, which is better suited to study interference suppression in bivalent stimuli. So here you can see that the demands in the two tasks, they are typically broadly in the same domain, they are both executive control tasks, but the more specific aspects of executive control are actually different in these two tasks, which are being tested in the study. Interestingly, in the current experiment, the bilingual advantage was observed only on the Simon task, but not in the day-night task. So, which led the authors to actually assume that bilingual children are better than monolinguals on tasks that require attention to be selectively directed to specific cues and in conflict resolution, but not on tasks that actually elicited a habitual response. Something that is very, very overlearned. Looking at pictures of day and saying day is something that they have habitually learned, and in this case, there is no bilingual advantage that they are observing. Moreover, these results also pointed out that the selective advantage of bilinguals results actually from a practice in attentional control that they gain from managing the interference from their two co-activated languages, which gradually transfers to increased levels of executive controls in similar non-verbal tasks like the Simon task. Now, obviously, similar conclusions could be reached from a study that measured the general scope of bilingual advantage by administering a much larger battery of tasks, say 9 tasks in all, and which were all hypothesized to index some different aspect of executive control, although all of these 9 tasks involved some type of inhibition. Now, Carlson and Melzoff actually conducted this study on 3 groups of kindergarten children, among which the 3 groups were a group of Spanish-English bilingual children who had been exposed to both languages since birth, another group of L1 English children who attended an immersion elementary school where they received instruction in English for half the time and either in Spanish or Japanese for half the time. So these are mixed groups, and a control group of L1 English children who attended traditional schools, receiving only English education. Now, despite the fact that the children in the bilingual group had relatively lower scores on a test of verbal ability and had parents coming from relatively lower educational levels, their scores on all of these tests were actually equivalent to the scores of the other groups. However, interestingly, when the verbal ability and parental education level were statistically controlled for, the composite executive functioning score for the based on all the 9 tests actually showed superior performance for the bilingual group as compared to other groups. So you can say that while initially, the differences could have been because of lower parental educational level, socioeconomic status and so on, but you actually, when you control for them and basically just are looking for differences in executive control, the bilingual group is actually performing much better than the monolingual group. The performance in the immersion and control groups, however, did not really differ from each other. So that is also something to consider. Now, each of the individual tests, when you start zooming in, when you're looking at each of the individual tests, actually suggested an advantage for the bilingual group, but it was statistically significant in only a small number of tests, wherein the shared feature of these subtests was that they shared the property of inhibition of attention to misleading contextual information. So here we are seeing that while you can talk about a degree of general executive control advantage, the actual advantage is in a very specific ability of inhibiting misleading information, wherein the bilinguals actually shine and outperform correspondingly matched monolingual groups. Now, this pattern of results was further confirmed through the results of a factor analysis that was conducted on this data of all the 9 tests, which revealed 2 distinct factors that the researchers interpreted as measuring the children's ability to manage conflicting attentional demands and the ability to control impulses. The bilingual advantage, so there are these 2 factors. First is managing conflicting attentional demands. The second is ability to control impulses. Now the bilingual advantage was, however, found to be limited to the first of these 2 factors, which is managing conflicting attentional demands, but not in the ability to control impulses. So, if you look at this in totality, in conclusion, it appears that the bilingual advantage does not apply generally to all situations that require inhibitory control, but to only circumstances wherein distracting information must be inhibited or ignored, which is analogously similar to, similar to the bilingual's task of inhibiting or suppressing their non-target language. Also, another caveat from these findings was that the extent of the bilingual advantage actually depended upon the degree of bilingualism, how proficient in both the languages these bilinguals were, how early they had started learning both the languages, and so on. Now, while it was established that a certain degree of bilingual advantage actually exists in younger children, we can also look at studies investigating whether the advantage exists in younger adults and older adults and so on. So one of the first studies that we could talk about was conducted by Costa and colleagues who tested young adults, all highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals. They compared their performance with Spanish monolinguals matched with these bilinguals on age and educational levels. The participants actually performed the ANT task, or the attentional networking task, which was developed by Fan and colleagues and which is designed to reflect 3 types of attentional processes. Executive control, basically performance performance monitoring and conflict resolution; alerting, to basically becoming and staying alert; and orienting, basically orienting and selecting a subset of information from the input. Now, before I go on to describe this task, you can imagine the ANT task as a task having 5 arrows on the screen. The central arrow could face towards the left or towards the right, whereas the flanking 2 arrows on this side and 2 arrows on that side could be facing on the opposite side to the central arrow or on the same side to the central arrow. Basically, the task of the individuals is to respond to the direction of the central arrow while ignoring the distracting information that are being provided by the flanking arrows. In this sense, basically the ANT task provides a very interesting and a very high resolution test of their executive control abilities. If you want to read more about it, you are welcome to read the Fan's paper, wherein he talks about the different nuances of this task. For the scope of this lecture, I am sort of limiting myself to just this very small description of this task. Now, in line with the results of Bialystok and colleagues, which were gained through the Simon task, the bilinguals actually suffered less interference from incongruent flankers than the monolingual participants, suggesting that they actually had better abilities of conflict resolution in the face of misleading information. The bilinguals were also found to be overall faster than monolinguals. Also, it was seen that bilinguals could make better use of alerting cue than the monolinguals, suggesting that the alerting mechanism works much better in bilinguals as opposed to monolinguals. So while the Fan's ANT task actually provides a highly resolved way of looking at the different aspects of executive control in terms of executive control, alerting and orienting, here you can see that there is a very significant difference in bilinguals and monolinguals on very specific aspects of this task, which again sort of concurs with the evidence that we have been seeing so far. Another study with adults was conducted by Colzato and colleagues who investigated the nature of bilingual advantage by comparing two manners of cognitive control. Remember, we talked about proactive and reactive control, proactive and reactive inhibition when we were talking about language control. Let's just recap it a little bit. So the active inhibition is supposed when the central control system is directly inhibiting or deactivating memory nodes associated with the non-target language, whereas reactive inhibition is supposed to operate if the current goal, let's say for example the intention is to speak in English, actually boosts the activation in the memory nodes representing the target node. So basically you are indirectly boosting the activation of the target language, and through lateral inhibition suppressing the nodes from the non-target language. So Colzato and colleagues actually wanted to basically compare active and reactive inhibition in this task. Now, according to this view, inhibitory effects actually do not result from actual inhibition exerted by an inhibitory control system, but from a control mechanism that works through facilitation. Colzato and his collaborators actually examined the nature of bilingual advantage by comparing the performance of adult balanced Dutch-English bilinguals and Spanish monolinguals on the three non-verbal cognitive control tasks that, according to the authors, differed from one another in the type of inhibition mechanism they appealed to. Based on the results, the authors concluded that the bilinguals performed better than monolinguals in maintaining action goals, which basically involved activation in the goal-relevant memory representations. So again, what we can see is that bilinguals are obviously showing some kind of a beneficial advantage as opposed to monolinguals when it comes to the very specific aspect of inhibiting irrelevant information. So all in all, it can be concluded that if you look at both the child studies and adult studies, it clearly suggests that bilingualism brings superior cognitive control that is manifest from early childhood and lasts up till adulthood. This is what I wanted to talk to you about in this lecture. I will see you in another lecture with more about bilingualism and other cognitive functions. Thank you.